más bien dicho, la teoría evolutiva estándar, caracterizaría, describiría, explicaría la producción adaptativa de entidades discretas con interacciones o funcionales entre rasgos o clados en temporalidades específicas de procesos macro y microevolutivos. Esta representación estándar de la teoría evolutiva también tiene, además de esas asunciones teóricas, se refleja con asunciones ontológicas fundamentales, las que he mencionado al principio como consecuencias ontológicas de las metáforas empleadas. Los organismos, sabemos, y tenemos programas de investigación para dar cuenta de ello, no se encuentran separados, establecen interacciones profundas, en muchos casos simbióticas, y además no son entidades discretas, sino que funcionan como comunidades, holobiontes específicamente. Estos holobiontes, asimismo, forman parte de comunidades, pero no de una biocenosis del modo antiguo, o según su antigua significación, la antigua significación de este término, digo, sino más bien ahora forman una holobiocenosis, es decir, una comunidad de organismos que a su vez son comunitarios. Para llevar el tema, además, hacia una connotación temporal y procesual, tenemos que los organismos, o estos holobiontes, pueden más bien identificarse como ciclos biológicos, más que como entidades fijas y discretas, y que estos ciclos biológicos en esta comunidad, a su vez, se encuentran montados sobre una estructura fenológica en donde están anidados todos los organismos. Pero para rematar, el nicho que toda esta comunidad ocupa no es ni preexistente, ni siquiera abiótico, sino que se trata asimismo de otro holobionte o de otra holobiocenosis, o si se quiere, de otro sistema anidado de ciclos biológicos. Y ya para que las cosas adquieran las dimensiones propias de la complejidad biológica, nos encontramos que estos sistemas ecológicos están embebidos por una matriz ubicua y perpetua, también diríamos, porque desde que la vida es vida así lo está, en una matriz ubicua de microorganismos. A la totalidad de este sistema sinecológico, voy a llamar aquí metaholobionte, es decir, una comunidad de comunidades de organismos que se encuentran estableciendo relaciones simbióticas, recíprocas y fenológicas. Así, tenemos ya el marco planteado para hacer que la evolución sea más bien la que esté dispuesta a negociar sus metáforas más arraigadas y pueda acercarse a lo que es propio del desarrollo de los organismos y de su ecosistema. Entonces, podemos ya dejar de hablar de estas unidades para hablar de procesos holobióticos y considerar la evolución en función de estos, dejar de hablar de estas relaciones coadaptativas para empezar a entender los procesos simbióticos, y los programas de desarrollo podrían entenderse mejor desde una perspectiva de procesos fenológicos anidados. Esto implica que tendríamos a partir de ahora una visión que es holobióntica en primer lugar, sinecológica en segundo lugar y asimismo fenológica en tercer lugar. El neodarwinismo, la síntesis extendida y esta visión podrían coexistir de acuerdo a los fines particulares para los que cada uno de estos programas se desplieguen, y desde esta perspectiva triple cambiaríamos las asunciones evolutivas iniciales por otras, como por ejemplo empezar a hablar de procesos que son funcionalmente recíprocos, organizados cronológicamente y que se desempeñan en sistemas sinecológicos, comprometiendo a holobiontes y a comunidades de holobiontes con una matriz ubicua de microorganismos, y que están anidados todos estos elementos en procesos que expresan la simbiología, es decir, esa matriz o ese anidamiento de funciones simbióticas, y la fenología, esa matriz de asociaciones y de cronogramas de desarrollo, en esa fenología anidada, digo, que son en sí mismos un sistema del desarrollo. De modo que ya podemos representar de una nueva manera la evolución, no en la manera de la usanza anterior, sino como una teoría que caracteriza, describe, que explica a sí mismo la producción sinecológica de procesos continuos, que son estos fundamentalmente simbióticos y fenológicos, y que se estabilizan alrededor de ciclos biológicos que son coexistentes, para empezar, y que están siendo constantemente constituidos de modo recíproco. A esta representación, vamos a llamar aquí representación sinecológica de la teoría evolutiva, y es con ella que podemos ya atender a la posibilidad de que los organismos, además de modificar sus entornos proactivamente a través de estructuras o a través de la modificación de rasgos, características o dimensiones del espacio adaptativo, lo hagan también en las dimensiones temporales de ese paisaje fenológico. Las asunciones ontológicas, que el implemento de estas nuevas metáforas, son el punto de partida y no el punto de llegada. Son las asunciones que provienen a partir de las cuales las nuevas metáforas son mucho mejores y más útiles con vistas a esta finalidad de nuestra agenda de describir cómo se sucede la construcción temporal de los nichos en los ecosistemas. Dicho esto, con esta perspectiva podemos efectivamente difuminar estos módulos cuasi independientes de los procesos biológicos y emprender una investigación que nos permita declarar la estructura temporal de los ecosistemas y cómo no los organismos actuando aisladamente, sino cómo estos metaholobiontes producen ese paisaje. Ya para entrar en la recta final de mi charla o de mi presentación, quisiera citar aquí 10 aspectos fundamentales que considero yo son necesarios tener en mente al momento de empezar a entender la construcción de nichos desde esta perspectiva de la modificación ecoevolutiva de este coronopaisaje. El primero de ellos es definir cuál es nuestra agenda de preguntas y partiendo de darnos cuenta de que el asunto fundamental para la evolución desde esta representación cinecológica es relacionar el origen de la vida con su diversidad y con su organización en el ecosistema. Cómo se estructuran los organismos en el ecosistema da pistas y establece nuevas causalidades de cómo la vida misma se constituye. El segundo aspecto sería, ha quedado claro, entender como nivel de análisis el nivel de las comunidades biológicas en el ecosistema y reconocer que en este nivel de organización el carácter distintivo es un principio de coexistencia por el cual se estructuran estas comunidades. Tanto más coexistencia o potencial de coexistencia, más rico y nutrido será ese anidamiento simbiótico y ese anidamiento de fenologías que coexistan. El tercer paso queda claro que es asumir el construccionismo de los nichos en función de este principio de coexistencia, entendiendo que los organismos modifican proactivamente un entorno que es por sí dinámico y en el cual ellos están inmersos en un sistema anidado de temporalidades y de procesos y compromisos simbióticos. El cuarto paso sería entender como continuos todos los procesos estructuradores, es decir, que habría una relación causal, cocausal, entre los procesos de selección natural y los procesos de construcción de nichos, y en que entre estos se establece un continuo de variaciones causales. Los organismos seleccionables y los entornos selectivos se construyen recíprocamente y a ciertos fines es mejor entenderlos como indistinguibles, para otros sí será mejor implementar criterios de distinción. El quinto paso es que existe asimismo una continuidad en lo que concierne a las matrices de la heredabilidad. Hay una relación también cocausal entre estructuras que almacenan esta herencia genética y las estructuras que almacenan las herencias ambientales. La matriz genética, los genomas, y la matriz simbiótica fenológica asimismo se construyen recíprocamente y a ciertos fines son difíciles de distinguir y de filtrar unas de otras. El sexto punto en el que quisiera enfatizar es que asimismo existe una multiplicidad cualitativa de legados hereditarios. Tenemos un amplio espectro de herencias no genéticas que no son exclusivas, ya sabemos, del flujo genealógico ni de la información genética, y tenemos que apelar también a eventos como las inducciones fenológicas, la comunicación, la educación y todos esos otros aspectos a los cuales podemos contemplar cuando consideramos esta triple hélice que es metáfora del taller que nos congrega. El séptimo paso sería que estamos dispuestos ahora a reconocer no solamente innovaciones morfogenéticas, no solamente rasgos homólogos, sino que vamos a empezar a tener que conceptualizar lo que serían innovaciones simbióticas y fenológicas, nuevos cronogramas de interacción, nuevos pactos recíprocos de cooperación. De modo que nuestro tratamiento de la evolución evolutiva será codependiente, pero no reducida a las hipótesis de homología. se producen, como he dicho, nuevos pactos simbióticos, nuevos cronogramas para la ejecución de estos acuerdos simbióticos. El octavo paso, o más bien dicho, la octava clave en relación con la anterior, habla de que la innovación evolutiva, asimismo, codependiente de las hipótesis de homología, lanzará la mirada a la evolución convergente de nuevos acuerdos funcionales, de nuevos ritmos para la sincronización en la ejecución de tales acuerdos. El noveno aspecto clave sería que en un rango que va desde las construcciones materiales de individuos hasta las construcciones funcionales y simbióticas y fenológicas dadas por la totalidad de la comunidad, hay una multiplicidad cualitativa de actividades de construcción. No nos hemos de restringir simplemente a aquellas en las que paradigmáticamente un organismo construye una estructura o modifica conspicuamente ese entorno, sino que hemos de atender a esos rasgos cualitativos que las comunidades de organismos en el entorno, incluyendo desde luego las instancias temporales. Finalmente, en este amplio espectro de nichos construidos, debemos determinar, esto va con relación al anterior, una multiplicidad cualitativa de actividades de construcción. El décimo paso sería que desde una perspectiva simbiótica, las comunidades también modifican el paisaje temporal y amplían el potencial de coexistencia de los ecosistemas. ¿Cómo lo hacen? En esta estructura fenológica simbiótica, a través de la construcción de nichos, los organismos coexistentes no solo dividen o segregan en las dimensiones físico-químicas o espaciales, sino además al segregar en el ámbito de la temporalidad producen mayor potencial de coexistencia. Para terminar, hemos hecho o he tratado de plantear la idea de que plantear una trayectoria que va desde las asunciones del mecanicismo hasta las asunciones de un organicismo sinecológico, como lo llamo aquí, y cómo habría un tipo de gradación que va desde las metáforas del organismo máquina hasta la metáfora del metaholobionte, de la holobiocenosis, y a esta metáfora de la construcción de nichos simbióticos y fenológicos, o lo que es lo mismo, nichos temporales. Os dejo con esta última presentación donde se recapitulan los 10 aspectos clave citados y les agradezco por el tiempo, espero no haberme pasado. Muchísimas gracias por la atención, gracias a todos.
Muchísimas gracias, Francisco, por tu charla, muy interesante. Ahora vamos a tener el comentario del doctor Mario Casanueva. No sé si está por ahí, doctor. Es que todos se llaman David Suárez, entonces no sé si alguno de ellos sea el doctor Mario Casanueva o su equipo.
No.
¿No está por ahí?
Pues
Ok,
damos el
entonces,
break,
sí.
¿y si llega?
Sí, pasaríamos al receso. ¿5 minutos?
No,
¿10?
15.
15 minutitos de break. Tenemos ahí en el chat, puso David una liga a Gathertown. Es una plataforma de metaverso donde reconstruimos la Facultad de Ciencias. Entonces, si gustan, también pueden interactuar por ahí en el coffee break o en cualquier otro momento. Esa plataforma está abierta 24/7 durante lo que dure el congreso y se puede utilizar para tener conversaciones uno a uno y visitar la Facultad de Ciencias de manera virtual. Nos vemos entonces a las 12:10. Andrew Reynolds is professor of philosophy at Cape Breton University. He has published in various history and philosophy of science journals and is the author of Peirce's Scientific Metaphysics, the Philosophy of Chance, Law and Evolution. Andrew, si estás por ahí, para discutir, vamos a pedirles que soliciten la palabra levantando su manita en Zoom, y las personas que están dentro del auditorio se pueden acercar aquí a la computadora para tomar la palabra al terminar la presentación de Andrew. Muchas gracias.
Hi, can you hear me?
¿Me escuchan?
I'm trying to start my video, but it's telling me it's not going to work. That's okay. I only need to share my screen.
David is enabling your video. David is enabling your video now.
Okay, thank you.
Raúl, encender el video de Andrew.
Well, you don't need to see me.
I think it's enabled now.
Okay, yeah, it's oh, there we go. Okay, now
So
I
we
need
can
to,
see your plant.
okay, I don't see anyone, but perhaps I have to. I'm not sure. Anyways, oh, okay, I can see myself there. So let me share my screen with you. Let's see, should go. Can people see my screen now?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Okay, thank you. Well, first, let me thank David and the rest of the team for organizing this terrific workshop. I have to apologize that I don't speak Spanish, so some of the last talks I didn't understand a whole lot of, but they sound very interesting, and I'm hoping that perhaps they'll be available sometime in translation. So what I've done is just to help facilitate this general discussion about the topic of Richard Lewontin and metaphors in biology is to prepare a few slides. Should only take a few minutes to go through them to help us organize our thoughts. So I will just start with this quote from Lewontin from the Triple Helix. "It is not possible to do the work of science without using a language that is filled with metaphors." And many of the speakers have spoken about this the last few days, even those who haven't been speaking in the sessions on biology and metaphor. So just as a reminder of the talks we've had on this topic, we've had first Dan Nicholson spoke on the Triple Helix Revisited. Then we had Alejandro Hernandez Daniel, who spoke on la referencia metafórica a la disciplina de la embriologia on la epistemologia genética de Jean Piaget. Alejandro Ramirez Padrón on la revaloración de la metáfora de la adaptación de Richard Lewontin y su influencia on la teoría sintética extendida, with a commentary by Irma Lucia Montero Dominguez. And this afternoon, we've had David Suarez Pascal on the role of metaphor in Lewontin's philosophy of science. And then lastly, Denchitso, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that properly, and I apologize if I'm not, Denchitso Toro Rivadeneira on temporal construction of Nice construction, the 10 keys to understanding that. And I didn't quite catch what was going to happen with the commentary that was going to be done by Mario Casanova Lopez. Perhaps that's going to follow. So let me just say a few words about Lewontin's influence. one of the key things, especially for me, when I was an undergraduate in philosophy, is Lewontin's influence was that he encouraged philosophers and historians of science, and indeed biologists, to look seriously at the role and the impact of metaphor on science. With his criticisms of machine metaphors and adaptation as organisms fitting a pre-existing environment, and the metaphors of development and evolution. And this was at a time when most philosophers of science were still focused on looking at science as consisting of theories, as abstract, logical, syntactic devices, with the implication being that there is no legitimate role for metaphor or for social forces or influences in or on science. And so consequently, few philosophers of science bothered to pay much attention to that, with the exception of people like Evelyn Fox Keller and people like that, Mary Hesse and some others. Lewontin himself introduced some interesting metaphors of his own, of course, into evolutionary biology and the philosophy of biology. I think all of these have been mentioned already in the last couple of days. Lewontin seemed to like construction metaphors, and I'll say a word about that in a second. So we've just heard a very interesting talk about the idea of niche construction. But if you remember from Lewontin's article on analysis of variance, he had this interesting metaphor. It's not quite so much a metaphor as an analogy, where he talks about how it is misguided to try to tease apart the relative contributions of genetics as opposed to environment in the development of particular phenotypes, including human behaviors, by saying these analysis of variance models assume that the human is like a brick wall, to the construction of which you have two workers laying bricks. And if that were the case, you could measure the relative contribution of each by counting how many bricks they contributed to the wall. But he used the analogy or metaphor that it's actually more like two causal agents, one mixing up the mortar and the other laying the bricks down. Then it becomes much more difficult to decide who contributes more to the wall. And in fact, the question may not make any sense at all. Then, of course, with his book, The Triple Helix, where he tried to talk about the tangled co-evolutionary and co-causal relationships between gene, organisms, and environment, Lewontin introduced this metaphor. The metaphor of the triple helix can be extended beyond discussions about gene and organisms and environments. And in fact, Lewontin did this, but we can think about science, society, and nature, or ciencia, sociedad y naturaleza, as also being entangled in this way as a triple helix. And the thing that Lewontin consistently emphasized was that there's this dialectical process of mutual influence between these three things. Science influences society and nature. Nature influences science and society. They all are influencing one another. None of them can be understood on their own, separate from the other two. And so one of the other things that Lewontin emphasized is that science and politics are in fact inseparable, that they're always going to be some kind of causal relationship on the two. So I got thinking about, what was there a fundamental metaphor that would capture Lewontin's thinking about biology and science more generally and society? And obviously he talks a lot about dialectics, and dialectics is, I don't think it quite qualifies as a metaphor, but it certainly generates many metaphors. So I think we could think of dialectics as a kind of fundamental framework for Lewontin's thinking. And if my pointer will work here, I like this picture for a couple of reasons, because there does seem to be a triple helix here on the chalkboard that he's drawing. And so emphasizing this idea that we have to understand these three things, whether they're genes, organisms, and environments, in this entangled dialectical process where they're in a continual process of co-influencing and co-creating one another, or whether we're talking about science, society, and nature itself, or reality. The other thing I like about this picture is Lewontin is here giving the workers' salute, or the Marxist salute, which of course is very important for his dialectical approach to biology. But it also, I think, fits well with his emphasis on construction. I think he liked to think of himself as allied with the physical laborers, as opposed to the more privileged intellectual laborers that led to metaphors of things like programs and computers and master blueprints and things like that. So just before I finish, I'll just point out that I have forthcoming this month a paper that I've dedicated to the memory of Richard Lewontin in The Biologist, the magazine of the Royal Society of Biology, called Master Your Metaphors, that talks in more detail about some of the things I've written about in a couple of books that I've written in the last couple of years on the topic of metaphors and cell biology. And I have one out this year called Understanding Metaphors in Biology that looks at metaphors right from genetics and protein biology up to evolution and biomedicine. But with that, I think we'll open the discussion up for questions and comments. I don't know if someone will want to translate if some of this conversation is going to be in Spanish for my benefit. I would really like to hear what people have to say. And if Spanish is their preferred language, again, I apologize, I won't be able to follow it, but maybe someone can keep me informed about what the discussion is if it goes in that direction. So thank you very much.
We have simultaneous translation. If you click in the interpretation icon, it's a little world.
Oh, okay.
At the bottom of the screen, you can select your preferred language. You can select English.
Oh, okay. I didn't know that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to stop sharing my screen so we can. How do I stop?
Thank you very much, Andrew.
Okay,
we will begin the discussion. If anybody has a comment or a question, now is the time. Trevor?
Yeah, I wanted to ask about dialectics as a metaphor. I think it is actually a metaphor, isn't it? I mean, because initially it's about a back and forth conversation with questioning and answers. But of course, once you get to Hegel and Marx and Lewontin, it doesn't seem to be explicitly about verbal or even written dialogue anymore. So doesn't that mean it is a metaphor after all?
Well, I'll just jump in quickly. I think it's worth distinguishing carefully between metaphors, similes, and analogies, which often get blurred together and confused. So I'm not sure if dialectics is a metaphor unless it's being used as a metaphor, as a figure of speech, whereby we describe one thing in terms that are more literally used to describe another thing. But I think it certainly can be used as a whole bunch of metaphors. And I was hoping that Daniel Nicholson would be here today because he, his whole emphasis on a process philosophy and organicism, I think, is one way of cashing dialectics out in terms of metaphors, in terms of, non-mechanistic metaphors, thinking of organisms as open systems of energy, as streams and vortices and things like that. So that's what I would say, but be interested to hear what other people think.
Some David Suarez has a question that is not David Suarez. You can go ahead. persona que levantó la mano que no es David Suárez, pero dice David Suárez.
The person that raised their hand that says David Suarez, but it's not David Suarez. Please go ahead.
I was confused. I didn't know it was me. Should I close my microphone? Can you hear me? Maybe I can go there. I will go there.
Está aquí en el auditorio. Si quieres, acércate.
It is a person here in the auditorium. That's why there's this feedback.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
So escuchar, sí.
I wanted to point out something that Trevor mentioned.
I think we will do without the microphone. Just
Okay.
loudly, yeah, on the computer. So in this one.
Can you hear me better now?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So from Trevor's comment and question, I just wanted to point out one thing that although, as he mentioned, originally dialectics was or came from the Greek philosophers, I think Lewontin's use of dialectics is much more aligned with the reinterpretation or updating of dialectics that Marx and Engels did, as well as Lenin. So in that case, I think if we want to think about dialectics either as a metaphor or not, we need to start from thinking on dialectics in the Marxist perspective and not in the old Greek perspective of it. And in my opinion, just to make the comment short, I would agree with Andrew's idea that is more of a framework rather than a metaphor. But yeah, I will be glad to hear other comments as well, other opinions. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there a response or another comment related to this topic? ¿Sí nos escuchan? Sí.
I would just say I agree that quite obviously Lewontin is influenced by Marxist dialectics. He makes it very clear in his writings. He's being influenced by Engels in particular. The dialectical biology starts off with a dedication to Friedrich Engels, who often got it wrong, but got it right where it counted, I think is the phrase he uses.
Does anybody else have another comment or question? Are you raising your hand? No, not yet. Anybody here at the auditorium or in the online session? Another of the 100 David Suarez?
It's a very popular name.
Yeah, we have a lot of David Suarez. Dani Serrano?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. My question is, how prevalent do you think is this view of evolutionary biology today? in contrast to other views that are more close to a positivist framework.
Can I just ask for clarification? When you say this view, do you mean the dialectical view?
Yes, dialectical view represented by Lewontin and inspired by Marxist Engels' perspective.
I'll just give my 2 cents and then let other people speak. I suspect it's becoming more common to think about biology in this way, about the idea that you can't separate the organism from the environment, and you can't separate genes from their environments or cells. But I don't think yet it's very common to discuss it in these openly Marxist dialectical terms that Lewontin does. So I think it's a way of articulating this new view that talks about the importance of holobionts and niche construction and things like that. But to parse it or to phrase it in such overtly Marxist dialectical terms, I don't think is yet very common, and it may not become very common for political reasons, which would again make Lewontin's point about how it's so difficult to disentangle science from politics. But I'll let other people weigh in too.
Thank you, Andrew. We have another participant, another David Suárez, and then Rosaura Ruiz. El otro David Suárez, puedes hacer tu pregunta o comentario y después Rosaura Ruiz.
I think I might be.
A ver, a mí me toca Rosaura
Oh.
Ruiz, soy Rosaura.
No, primero el otro David y después tú.
Ah, ok. A ver, tantos Davides que...
Creo que yo soy el otro David. Soy Jorge, por cierto.
Well, my name is Jorge, it's not David. Hello, everyone.
I just wanted to add really quick to what Andrew said, and I wanted to mention that the EES, the extended evolutionary synthesis, or la síntesis extendida, it is obviously a dialectical understanding of evolution, and Lewontin is incredibly influential, but they're consciously and very carefully refuse to use words such as dialectical or anything related to Marxism at all, because any kind of whiff of that language, I would say, immediately will raise flags and alarms with the community, the scientific community, I should say. And to be honest, and I'm speaking from the American perspective, right? I work in the US, with philosophers as well. So sadly, no, dialectical is not very popular in the US. Thank you, that was it for me.
Thank you. I don't know if there is a response from Andrew. Then we have Rosaura Ruiz, Francisco Vergara, and Trevor Pierce.
¿No seguía yo? Ah, bueno, como cuando me digan.
Sí, si no hay respuesta de Andrew, sigue Rosaura Ruiz, luego Francisco Vergara.
Okay, if there's no reply by Andrew, then Rosaura, you're the next, okay? Rosaura, go ahead with your comments, okay? Rosaura says, good afternoon to you all people. In the first place, I would like to thank you for all the talks, for all the comments. It has been an outstanding event. I'm really happy because of that. Regarding this situation, I would like to point out that without any question, this focus from Wu and Lewin about the dialectic, the Marxist dialectics, really achieve to move forward on the discussions on the idea of the niche construction. And of course, the name itself, the term, the concept. But I would like to mention also that Darwin, of course, he thought also in the fact that the organisms modify their environment. It couldn't be any other way around, by the way. But in the case of Darwin, we have the book about the about the earthworms and how do they modify their environment and how it makes the earth suitable for sweeting a lot of trees and plants, you know, and so it is something that we consider. But also, I believe that the focus of Lewontin and many of their followers have been fundamental overall in what I mentioned previously in developing this idea in setting evidence. Several examples that we can quote about this, such as Darwin with the earthworms, in several cases in several species, and we can see how this interaction is not only in the environment that is selecting the organisms and allows its evolution, but also every single organism can modify their environment.
No sé qué pasó.
Sorry, I don't know what happened. We had some feedback. Okay. So, thank you very much, David. So, what I would like to highlight the most is the fact that the big importance of the focus, the Marxist focus of Lewontin's Marxist focus. Of course, it is not new, but this concept, this idea is not new. This was present in both Darwin and the synthetic theory, and development is relevant. And I think that this is what we must analyze from other perspectives that are non-Marxist, apparently non-dialectic. I think that we have given huge steps forward. Thank you very much for the space. Eva says, thank you, Rosaura. I don't know if Andrew, do you want to add any comments to Rosaura's comment, or shall we continue with the participations?
I would just say, yeah, thank you for the question, the comment. And I think you're right that mentioning the book on earthworms. Clearly, Darwin recognized that organisms modify their environments. I think maybe some of the criticism comes from this idea of adaptation as fitness. So the idea that, you know, the organisms has to fit a previous existing environment like a key to a lock, and whether it's fair to, you know, hang all that on Darwin or not. Certainly Trevor Pierce knows a lot more about the history of these ideas of environment and adaptation than I, so maybe he'll want to say something about that. But yeah, we can move on to the next.
Muchas gracias, Andrew. Thank you very much. Now we have the...
Thank you, Andrew. Now we have...
Okay, so this time I'll try to use I'm going to speak in Spanish, hoping that the translation system is working properly.
Está funcionando, sí.
Muy bien. Pues en primer lugar.
Okay, so in the first place, I also asked Rosaura, I would like to recap that even though we have had some technical issues, the meetings, the talks have been amazing. It is great that after the pandemics, we were able to do this summit with the team of the International Society, with the members of the International Society. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So, talking about what Jorge Lizarzaburgo mentioned, who I just met in this summit, in this Congress, I would like to mention that, if I correctly understand, is that the omission of the terminology related to dialectic and Marxism is an option that the academics from the global north who are developing the extended evolutionary synthesis, and in particular those who in that context are widely acknowledged as promoter of the former version, and I'm talking about Kevin Leyland from the St. Andrew University, and also John Patrick Smith, who also is in the UK. Is from the UK. I think that this opinion of Jorge needs to be etched with the information, and I will say it from my perspective, from an ethnographic perspective of science that is available. Many of you might remember that back in the day in 2016, in the facilities of the Royal Society, at the premises of the Royal Societies, we had a congress hosted by the British Academy, and it was the first meeting that correspond to the project that the Templeton Foundation was supporting about the extended evolutionary synthesis. I think that the name was looking the extended evolutionary science to the test. So when Kevin Leyland presented his lecture at that Congress, the genealogy regarding to the niche construction was related to Conrad Paddington, Lewontin. He has quoted him in many publications. He has quoted him in many. But you should say, well, since he was in a British auditorium, he had to mention the British guy, you know. But I think that that interpretation is also doubtful. I'm doubtful about that interpretation. I mean, like, we need to be serious. Maybe some of the people who proposes this in a more serious way, they recognize Paddington as a president, as an important president. But without any question, he's got a name shaped into this. I'm conscious that this is a celebration of Lewontin's work, and I agree with that. I only would like to mention all the equivalences that we're making for other theoretical contexts that have been developed in different ages and different places of the world, including Darwin, that Rosaura quoted him, right? Not everything will fit the same shoe to a dialectic or Lewinsian dialectic. So from a perspective of the biological sciences historiography, we need to be more careful with that. I think, and this is a hypothesis that I would need to sustain with data, so it applies to myself. I think that Lewontin would have the idea that it is necessary to make these detailed distinctions from the historical perspective. And as a complement to this comment, goes as follow. Currently, I think that all of us are conscious of the multiple ways in which the evolutionary thinking is linked with other academic perspectives or extra academic perspectives to get to know how to face the contemporary environmental crisis. We have talked about Anthropocene. To talk about that, I'm talking about the notions of Anthropocene that come from the social sciences, particularly the anthropology. I'm thinking about Anna Xing, for example. She has a sympathy of many theories of the evolution from which we have spoken during this event, the Holobions theory, that she attributes that to Scott Gilbert and collaborators. So in the context of these interactions, we have talked about how the theories about the relationship between nature and culture that we have outside this hemisphere, not only in the Americas, but in the indigenous people, this thinking that I'm going to not to talk about it as dialectic of, but as reciprocal causality, which is a concrete term that Leyland and collaborators use when they have made this work of explaining what is the theoretical structure of this. So, in these systems of knowledge that the ethnobiologists study, among others, they have these ideas of reciprocity. Many cases we can recognize with authors from Felipe Escolar, the one that we mentioned yesterday. There's no distinction between culture and nature in the way of conceiving the relationship between organisms and environments. For example, in the Amazon, in the Amazonian, the southeast of Asia, and in many African countries. This is a different matter, but this is something that I would like to talk to Lewontin before he passed away. Maybe it was a question that I would have loved to make to him. What is the idea of this evolutionary thing that we develop at universities as scientists as he was, about the epistemic status of the notions and the relationship between nature and culture in our Western language that we don't have with the indigenous populations. Someone mentioned well, all those populations that are human groups that we can consider that they have a condition without any privileges compared to us, because all that context of what are the conditions in which we could get to understand those concepts in ontologic terms and epistemic ways in the relationship of those human beings and the rest of the planet. I think that it is a topic that we should discuss in the framework of these celebrations of peoples as important as Lewontin. Thank you very much, Francisco. Oh, we have a lot of raised hands over here. Andrew, would you like to compliment Francisco's comments?
I would just say thanks for that. I mean, that's a really important point about the nature of the language that science uses to do science. It's not just like holding a mirror up to nature, of course. The language you speak brings with it a particular grammar that ends up categorizing things and processes and events in different ways. And it raises the important question about what are the implications that English has become the dominant language of science. It has pushed other perspectives to the margins. Here in Canada, of course, and in Cape Breton, we have become popular the idea of two-eyed seeing, of thinking about the natural world and even doing science from indigenous language perspectives, like Mi'kmaq here in Canada, or the Atlantic Canada. And Mi'kmaq has a very different grammatical structure. It's more like a process language. You don't have just objects. Everything is in process and relational. So if science were done in that language, it would probably look quite different. And of course, Lewontin would say, you know, that the accident that our science is done largely in English and other Indo-European languages has a lot to do with history and economics and politics and things like that. So yeah, I think that's a hugely important issue.
Muchas gracias, Andrew.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you. So let's just state an order, the order of the participants, and let's continue with Trevor Pierce, and let's go with Rosaura Ruiz, and then David Suarez with the photograph that I think that is the real David Suarez. Let's go, Trevor. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to echo some of the things that Jorge was saying, but make a few additional points, I think. Let me... Is that any better now?
Well, they're having some technical issues with the feedback. Well, we got a comment by Trevor Pierce on the chat.
Please.
Hello, is that better?
Yes.
Okay, so I posted something in the chat, which I think reflects the attitude of a lot of biologists towards some of the kinds of alternative approaches that were inspired by Lewontin. So
Go ahead.
So folks involved with the extended evolutionary synthesis, I think that's the camp of biologists that's more inspired by Lewontin, but of course there's a camp of other folks that are opposed in some way to the evolutionary extended synthesis. And I think that quotation from Spandrels is reflective of their attitude, right? So they'll look at the typology of alternatives and they'll say, well, these things happen sometimes, but they're not so important in general. And I think that attitude is probably pretty widespread. But there's also a kind of an additional point I think some of the speakers have made earlier in this workshop, which is that even the extended evolutionary synthesis people defending niche construction or species selection or multi-level selection or something like that, it's not clear that they would necessarily sign on to the dialectical approach presented in the last chapter, say, of The Dialectical Biologist, right? They might agree that, you know, for example, changes in the organism are a function of the organism and the environment. Changes in the environment are also a function of the organism and the environment. But just because you say that doesn't mean you embrace the sort of full-fledged dialectical approach. So I guess for me, it's kind of an open question whether even the biologists who are directly inspired by Lewontin, those involved in the extended evolutionary synthesis, to what extent are they really embracing the full program in all of its depth that Levins and Lewontin present in The Dialectical Biologies?
Thank you, Trevor. Is there anything you want to say, Andrew? We have added to the list Natalie Gontier at the end. Is there a response, Andrew?
No, please go ahead.
Okay.
Thank
We
you,
will
though, Trevor.
Thank you. We will go ahead. Vamos a continuar con la participación.
We will continue with the participation of Rosaura Ruiz, then after David Soares in blue, and then David Soares, the real one, and then Natalie Gontier. Rosaura, go ahead. Well, it's just this by responding. I would like to mention another case that peers have worked with, the Dewey. Dewey is not a Marxist philosopher. Nevertheless, he based many of his ideas in Darwinism and in the Hegel dialectic. That's the reason I am mentioning Trevor's work. He talks about the Hegel heirs and how did they have a strong and important influence on Dewey, and how Dewey creates an analogy between the evolution of a person since they are born until they pass away from the process that they have, mainly in education. That we have also been working David Soares and with Rosa Perez, but we have worked with them and we have seen how him with this idea of dialectic, of original Hegel's dialectic, has given great ideas to the education and how each individual modifies their environment as the environment modifies them. It is important to cite that the dialectic is not only reciprocity. It is the most important part and the most popular, but the dialectic methodology, overall, mainly interpreted by Hegel and Marx, is not only reciprocity. Okay, thank you very much for this space. Thank you, Rosaura. Then we shall continue with
there was another participant. He's coming over.
¿Ahí se me escucha bien? Sí.
Can you hear me properly? Well, we can. I'm going to make it short because I think that I wanted to say someone else said it. Trevor and Rosaura just mentioned that. But the most important thing that I wanted to point out and what I wanted to mention in my talk, it was not to limit the dialectic understanding to the reciprocity and moreover to the niche construction, because Lewontin and Levins, they were really explicit on explaining that they understood dialectics as in both as a methodology and as a philosophy. But as a philosophy and a conception of the world. And so the dialectic understanding that they had was similar to what Marx, Lenin, and Hegel did. And I think it was deeper. I totally agree with the fact that the heirs of the extended synthesis have been inspired strongly in Lewontin, but I think that they haven't expressed in such way that they really deeply share all the implications of the dialectic method. And it is not necessary, but I think that it is important that we have left behind a little bit of the reductionism that we have worked with in biology. But I think that their proposal is not only in the strategy. So I would say maybe they don't share the dialectic vision in the same way that they do, and the people who inspire them. Thank you.
Emiliano, muchas gracias, Emiliano. Si no hay alguna respuesta, seguimos con la participación de David Suárez. Ay, desapareció. David Suárez. Ah, sí, ahí está.
Sí, pero me salí para que no se vicie el sonido.
I'll have to prevent the feedback. Can you see me now? I cannot turn on my video for some reason.
Raúl, ¿podré encender mi video? Bueno, no hay problema. Digo, mi comentario tiene que ver un poco con lo de...
So,
okay.
Right, so my comment, so in that way you can see our school from the outside, but what I wanted to say relates to what Francisco Vergara was saying with regards to this relationship between nature and society and how dialectics could be connected in this way. So I wanted to go back to a point that I tried to cover in my presentation. And also I wanted to ask Andrew, because he knows the work of Charles Peirce. Besides, it seems to me that this first position with regards to Lewontin's metaphor and that of many other scientists, biologists as well, in the mid-20th century, during the second half of the 20th century, is a highly positivist conception that contributes to establishing this relationship between human beings and nature, between culture and nature. And this development that I discussed, that we have seen quoted in different presentations, and it is this dialectic sense that takes this relationship between the organism and the environment ultimately configures a very different character for metaphor. That's why, as Trevor said, we cannot abandon them, as Lewontin said. But beyond that, I would like to know if Andrew could tell us something in that respect. Thinking of a philosophy of science, a conception of this relationship between facts and theories, between the laws as an instrument that we use to try to account for nature. Because in this original conception that Lewontin had, was somewhat poor from the original standpoint, in the sense that evolution was just a change. It was just a change with fixed laws, and that this was questioned by Gould. Gould, for example, when he reviewed the development of the geology or the work of Ligel, he said that there is a sort of a deception, there's a trick, so to speak, by Ligel, by merging many different senses of uniformism. I'd like to connect that, and I would like to finish with this, and hopefully Andrew will have something to say about this. It has to do with the concept of Lewontin's concept of evolution, saying that evolution is changed with constant laws. Isn't that being replaced? And is that becoming part of this pragmatist conception by Charles Peirce, saying that not only phenomena change, but also the world and the entities that inhabit it, but that the laws themselves transform. And so in that same way, if the metaphor, isn't the metaphor a part of nature? And isn't it part of that evolution that covers the living organisms and so on? Could that determine a different relationship between nature and society? Because we are immersed in these metaphors in the end to understand what surrounds us. We are also part of nature. We're also part of that same evolution. And that is the end of my remarks. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, David. Andrew, you are on the spot.
Yeah, thank you, David, for that. And I must say, I apologize that I didn't realize I had interpretation ability during your talk. So I really regret that I didn't have that turned on, and I had a question for it. But yeah, I think one thing that I would say in response to what you said is, when you see what Lewontin has to say about why do scientists rely upon metaphor, it's often because science involves looking and thinking about things that we haven't previously experienced. So we have no existing vocabulary. One option would be to come up with brand new terms, new vocabulary for every new thing. But that would become very cumbersome. You would have to, carry around all these new terms for every new phenomenon. But the other thing is, by using existing vocabulary and transferring it, which is literally what metaphor means, or figuratively what metaphor means, to carry ideas from one discipline over to another, one idea to another, it allows you to recognize similarities or analogies between things. And so metaphor aids us in analogical reasoning. If we understand how this system works, and by metaphor we can transfer ideas to this system that we don't understand so well, it helps us understand it. So metaphor is beneficial just because it gives us some vocabulary that we have to impose on the world. The world doesn't tell us what language to use. It doesn't already come already labeled. So it provides us with terms to talk about the world. But also metaphor allows us to spread the accomplishments that we've made in understanding one piece of the world to new bits that we're trying to understand. So it's beneficial that way. It's not necessary for doing that, because we could reason analogically without using metaphor. We could just use similes, or we could just say, system B is analogous to system A, and you don't really have to use a metaphor at all. But metaphors are very convenient. The other thing about the laws themselves changing, yeah, I was just rereading the last chapter of The Dialectical Biologist yesterday. And he and Levins do talk a lot about it's not just the parts of the system that end up changing and the system itself, the very laws of the interactions end up changing over time. And that is something that Peirce, Charles Saunders Peirce, the 19th century physicist and philosopher, talked a lot about. I don't know to what extent Lewontin was familiar with Peirce. I don't know if that was of any influence. When I was at Harvard doing a postdoc and working on Peirce, I got to know Lewontin and spoke with him about some of these things, but I don't know that we ever talked about Peirce and this idea of the laws of nature themselves changing. But it is an interesting similarity you point to there. Thanks.
Thank you, Andrew. We have now the participation of Natalie Gontier and Irma, then Jorge.
Hello, yes, can you hear me?
We can hear you, Natalie.
I've been enjoying this discussion very much. We have drifted back a bit to metaphors, but I want to take us back again to this entire discussion that is going on about the politics of science and the relation that Lewontin had with the extended evolutionary synthesis. And I feel I need to speak up a bit because I was, a lot of things get lost in history. And we are all at the level that we are interpreting the actions of other people. I was a student at the KLI. I was a visiting scholar at the KLI at the time that they were organizing still at the Konrad Lorenz house, the workshop that would found the book on the extended evolutionary synthesis that Gert Müller and Massimo Pigliucci were making. And that has been a very foundational book for this entire movement of the extended evolutionary synthesis, for pushing the ideas of eco evo devo. And at the time, there was already recognition from the media and the press that this was going to be an important conference. And one of the journalists, for example, that featured this was Susan Mazur in America, who eventually ended up writing several books on the politics of science and the politics that happens, the wars that happen within the field of evolutionary biology. And I was not involved with the organization. I was merely a visitor there. But one of the questions that she raised, and one of the conversations that were happening then inside of the KLI at that moment was, why was, for example, Richard Lewontin, and also why was he not invited at that conference if he was such a figure that was important for these scholars? Why was he not invited? And so that was a bit of a discussion locally, and I must say I don't know whether he had actually been invited and declined the offer. I don't know. But I know, for example, that if you look into the relationship that Lewontin had with cultural evolution studies, there was this very interesting talk by Chris, where he wrote about, where he talked about the difficult relationship that Lewontin had with Edward O. Wilson at Harvard because of how he implemented natural selection theory in cultural evolution studies. In that regard, there is also a comment that has often been made, and that I think that scholars shy away from a bit. The concept of niche construction, the way that Lewontin defined it, was non-adaptationist, anti-adaptationist. Organisms do not adapt to the environment. They survive sometimes despite of the environment. And then when people such as Kevin Leland, for example, started to implement the 3 Darwinian principles in cultural evolution studies, and when they started to talk about niche construction, they really made that much more adapted. They used they made it much more into a happier story than that Lewontin, for example, meant it to be. And so in that regard, Also, in what regards to this extended evolutionary synthesis, this has been an important synthesis to emphasize ego evo devo, but insofar as we are talking about the politics of biology, I also want to say that the extended evolutionary synthesis is also in and of itself, as a member of the third way, if you want to talk politics as a member of the third way of evolution, I must say that the extended evolutionary synthesis is also not enough in providing an inclusive view of the current state of evolutionary biology. One of the things that the extended evolutionary synthesis does, for example, is consider symbiosis as a developmental process, but symbiosis, symbiogenesis, is much more than that. It is much more than inclusive inheritance. It is in and of itself an evolutionary mechanism. Also, if you look into the important work being done, for example, by James Shapiro on mobile genetic elements and on biological relativity of Dennis Noble, there then we see that this extended evolutionary synthesis is not really integrating these views either. So that is just a comment that I wish to make. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalie. Is there something you wanted to add, Andrew, or can we go with Irma?
No, I don't want to take up time from other people, but yeah, those are interesting comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Irma, vamos contigo. Ah, ahí viene. Perdón.
It's your turn. Well, she's coming. I apologize, Irma. Can you hear me well? Well, drawing from the comments made by Dr. Francisco, by Trevor and Emiliano regarding extended synthesis and this dialectic method and the metaphors proposed by Lewontin, especially the metaphor of construction. Well, precisely that is what my presentation was mostly about, and part of the information collection. In the information collection I did, I realized that the extended synthesis does take the spirit, or rather the influence of this proposal by Lewontin, but it recognizes that it's not necessarily to change the metaphor of adaptation for the metaphor of construction. Precisely, the niche construction theory only considers inserting this process of niche construction and making it a process that will be alongside natural selection, that it is not necessary to change it. So that is also reflected in the writings. One of the first chapters that he prepared in a book, Plotkins, if I remember correctly, where he bluntly says that I do recognize Lewontin's proposal, but I consider it to be too radical. So we will maintain the metaphor of adaptation. And so I will propose this, propose niche construction. Should I continue? There was this feedback. You can hear me well now? Great. So, and actually, in the final chapters by Flussi, that are authors that are part of the extended synthesis, it is stated that the extended synthesis for them, in terms of the philosophy of science, is not a radical change. It is not proposed to be a paradigm change. I won't go to whom, but a change of paradigm as such, but simply a proposal that is trying to recognize other elements, such as development, niche construction, and not as such something that wants to change synthesis. So I would like to share Francisco's, Trevor's, and Emiliano's proposal, or a comment that it is not necessarily about committing to Lewontin's proposal. In that case, that's what I wanted to say.
Muchas gracias, Irma. Seguimos con la participación.
Thank you very much, Irma. We will continue with Jorge's participation.
Gracias. My comments, so I just wanted to clarify something. At no point I meant to say, and if this is what people understood, I apologize, that the people such as Kevin Leyland Brown, Olin Smee, Massimo Piglucci, Kim Sterelny, etc., people associated with the EES, are closeted dialecticians who simply strategically decide not to use dialectics. At no point I meant to say that, so I apologize if that's what people understood. Of course, there are many roads to truth, and you don't have to be a dialectician to arrive there. First, and second, I just wanted to say that my point was more in relation to the sort of training the scientists received in the US, and it will be rather rare for a scientist in the US to be exposed to something as dialectics and a dialectical method, which, by the way, that's what, just a clarification, this takes me as a segue into the question that I wanted to ask. I've heard so far, I think from Rosario and Emiliano and somebody else, have used, I'm sorry, dialectical method. And that takes us back also to the first question that Trevor asked about how do we understand dialectics as a metaphor. And so I'm sending this to the chat because it reminded me of this quotation from the dialectical biologist, where Levins and Lewontin say that dialectical materialism is not and has never been a programmatic method. Reductionism is a scientific method, they said, but dialectical materialism is not. It's rather this dialectical analysis this analysis that provides a set of warning signs and signposts to help guide scientific endeavors. So I was just wondering if we can transition and people can answer, how do they understand? And I have no answer here. This is not like a gotcha moment or I'm very curious and seriously want to learn from other people and want to know, how do you understand dialectics as a scientific method? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jorge. Andrew, do you have an answer?
Well, that's a very interesting question, because I have to admit, when I was rereading the last chapter of The Dialectical Biologist, the conclusion titled Dialectics, at points I thought, wow, this sounds really quite dogmatic in some ways. You know, this dialectical perspective is really seeming to, it's less just a hypothesis or a framework or a tool for understanding things. And it does seem to have taken on a more fundamental ontological status, even if it is, even if the point is to be non-reductionist and to be more process-oriented and sensitive to the causal co-relationship of things. So I'm not sure. I'd be curious to know what other people thought, because I was struck that it did seem, he did seem quite strongly, they seem quite strongly committed to it, at least in that chapter. So I'd be curious to know what other people think.
Muchas gracias, Andrew. Seguimos con
Thank you so much, Andrew. We will continue with Francisco Vergara and then Emiliano.
Right. So let's try it in English this time. I think that what Natalie Gontier added to the discussion is exactly what we need. No, so more nuanced and more rich record of this trajectory of discussions. Some of them quite recent, actually, about the status of evolutionary theory, and within that, what is really the influence that people like Lewontin has had and not in this current and recent developments. So actually taking what she was saying about the possibility of proposing ideas for the book series that she has, I think this is a good topic, actually, no? Something that could be worked on collectively, no? To actually see more broadly what this history that we think we know is actually different if you look at contexts that have been put on the sides, and also bringing in some discussions that have been happening for a while, definitely, in some countries that could be considered under the traditional models of the historians of science, the periphery, no, of those metropolitan centers of knowledge production. So thank you very much, Natalie, for for that, it's something that's really important to know and discuss a bit more.
Muchas gracias, Francisco. Ahora se va a acercar Emiliano.
Thank you very much, Francisco. Emiliano will now use the microphone.
Yo quería responder un poco a los comentarios y
I
preguntas.
wanted to respond to the comments and questions that Jorge put on the table. Thanks again for that clarification, first of all, with regards to the relationship between the extended synthesis and dialectics. However, I wanted to focus more on the method. What did you understand about dialectics, or my interpretation of what it is that, first of all, it is a philosophical conception. It is a philosophical conception to a certain extent based on empirical evidence. Precisely because it is dialectic materialism. It embraces both dialectics and materialism. So, as such, it is based on empirical evidence to consider that there are certain principles, certain rules, or certain laws, which are what govern the way in which nature and matter behave. But in this last chapter of the dialectic biologist, these are very explicit in saying that these are not dialectic laws that are analog to the laws of physics or the laws of chemistry, but rather that these are universal principles that cannot be so directly proven, that they cannot directly be used as the scientific method we're used to. But my interpretation is that we can speak of a dialectic method because on the quote that was put on the chat box is that it is not a programmatic method. It cannot be used.
Precisamente lo que se criticó del...
So precisely what was criticized about this, that was mentioned at some point during a discussion here, is that the error of Lysenko's interpretation was attempting to use such dialectic principles only programmatically, using Lewontin's terms. But I believe that if we take this as very general principles, as a philosophical commitments, then we can use it as a supplementary method to the traditional scientific method, with this idea that they were conveying, that there should be warnings, so that even if we're using the most reductionist method, if the situation warrants it, we could know that what we're describing or discovering is not reality. We're discovering an aspect of it, which is what the reductionist method allows us to discover, and just remaining aware that the world is not like that, and thus supplementing those findings with new findings, not staying there with the idea that what was discovered with a reductionist method is actually reality, is just an aspect of it. And what the dialectic method should help us to do, following the laws of dialectics and the interpretation of the contrary, is the conversion of quality to quantity and denial of denial. Should not tell us at what point these principles will appear in when, in what shape, but it just tells us that at some point that will happen. So it is a warning to know that this will come up at some point, and being open to receive that evidence when it shows up, or to give rise to research questions that go that are according to that philosophical conception. So to respond to Jorge's question, in the end, I would say that it is first a philosophical conception, but from it, a method can stem. Is more a method of thought than a method of following steps. So that is my interpretation and my response to Jorge's question. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Emiliano. Tenemos más manitas. Hay un nuevo David Suárez que
Thank
no
you
las-
very much. We have more raised hands. There's another David.
Si no,
Natalie Gontier. You can, it is not that and cannot be reduced to that. And I think that it is a conceptual problem that can lead to a misinterpretation on how to work in dialectic ways. And it is something that Rosaura has mentioned already. So I think that we have had a wrong message into what dialectics are and what are the possibilities that we have there. And the other one has to do with the fact that if we read Hegel and we read Marx and then we read Lewontin, dialectic is not a method. It cannot be a method. It is a logical way of operation, a logical way of thinking that is fundamental to create dialectic, but that we cannot do it from a series of steps that take you to a dialectic thinking. It does not lead you to that. It is a set of steps to have a methodology. It is not a methodology that can produce interpretations of the general reality. So I think that it is important to take this into account, to take both things into account, because I don't think the Lewontin would be agree with these two things that we are mentioning. Beyond that, I think that we need to set we have a Lewontin that is selective, and as you are reading the text, and I think that it is in evidence when you go to the contingency cycles in the chapters, in the first chapters that Lewontin has there, Lewontin is way more radical. I mean, like, he has forgotten about adaptation and he makes less use of the term natural selection. He never denies it. I think that he is still thinking that he works in that line, on that line, but he is stopping use the natural selection. I think that Lewontin in their last writings, it is more radical. So I think that from my perspective, it is what I can say. So in the last writings that Lewontin has, we need to take into seriously the Cartesian metaphor, that is how to go to these mechanisms and reductionist ways of thinking. We need to understand why. So a possible interpretation on why Lewontin alludes to go serious on the Cartesian metaphor and the mechanicism. So here we have a lot of elements that allows us to go into the reality, and it's something that we cannot deny. Nobody can deny that. Not even Hegel can deny that in the studies on science. Here the situation is that these authors that are thinking in a dialectic logic, not as a method, but as a way of shaping the nature and the reality, is that these elements allows us to generate analysis into a dialectic movement that can provide alternate paths to interpret the reality compared to what we can do from a reductionist perspective. So here we have a series of things that are delicate because there has been of the dialectic that I don't agree with. I think that it is someone who works in the Conrad Lawrence, and she's working on this distinction. I think that it is interesting to make this difference and not to see it as a theoretical continuity. So it goes to Lewontin and it goes to the modification. So I don't think that this is not happening, and it didn't happen. So we need to be careful because we are looking at totally different things. Okay, thank you, Daniel.
No, aquí no, allá había alguien, no.
Sí, muchas gracias. Y un poco sobre estos últimos comentarios, ¿no?
Thank you.
Yo creo que estamos en un momento muy importante.
So I think that we are at a very important moment regarding the Lewontin legacy. It is a little bit the idea of this event, not just to honor the memories of Lewontin, but to get to know the things that he used to promote. But in terms of the evolutionary theory, we have had a lot of exegesis and apology. So we've been trying to look for what is what Darwin tried to say, what did Lamar wanted to say. So we need to be careful trying to avoid that with Lewontin. We need to understand that the ideas can be reinterpreted, and to read like Darwin is not Duchamsky. Darwin was another Darwin. He was a Darwin from the 19th century. With things from another periods, you know, the historiographical work what it has shown is that absolutely complicated to learn what it is, what Darwin was saying. With the more information we have, it seems that more information is leaving our hands. So we need to be careful not to turn Lewontin, even though we like his ideas, even though his influence, we need to try to avoid to turn him into a battle standard. Of course, we can get to understand better the dialectic because there are different understanding, but there are really interesting convergences that we have had here between Darwin and pragmatism, Lewontin, Marxism, Hegel. I think that it is something that we need to keep on working, but I think that it is really dangerous to say, no, Lewontin wouldn't have accepted this or that. I think that, I mean, you change your own ideas change within time. So it is not the same Lewontin in the 68 than Lewontin in the 21st century. Let's just be careful with that, okay? And also, let's talk about the things he wanted us to talk about. And in such sense, I think that we could honor this, construct with science and using the ideology without trying to destroy it ourselves, but to create a better social welfare. Thank you very much, David. Andrew Reynolds raised his hand, and I think that, well, I think it could be the last participation for this session. Go ahead.
Oh, well, thank you very much again for organizing this. This has been very interesting, and it sounds like a volume of essays may be birthed from this, to speak metaphorically. That would be great to see. I don't know if David Suarez wants to answer a question I had about his paper, if there's time, but I was curious to know, you said something that you thought Lewontin's cautious attitude toward metaphor may had something to do with his association with Popperian and Marxist ideas about science. So I was just wondering if you could briefly explain that a little bit, please. Thank you.
I want to... A ver, ¿qué?
Una pregunta de tu paper.
Let me see if I... Can you repeat the question? Please, Sandro?
Yes, from your abstract, you said that you think Lewontin's cautious attitude towards metaphor, the fact that he distrusted them, may have had something to do with the influence of Marxism and Popperian falsificationism on his understanding of science. So I was just wondering if you could expand on that just a little bit, please.
Sí, precisamente no me parece que
Yes. Well, sometimes it could go unnoticed. Of course, there is a philosophy of science behind the philosophy of biology, even though sometimes we might think that these are independent, that biology has set its own path, and that we don't have anything to do with science philosophy. But if you read the Lewontin from 1958, and then you go and you read, for example, the love through, sudden love through, that precisely from a Popperian conception of science. It says Darwinism is a theory that has been refused, but we see Gould, even if we have seen, he has a lot of similarities with Gould. Actually, he has in Gould, we have this explicit intention of changing the paradigm, of breaking the paradigm, but making the point with these metaphors. So it is that in his book in 2002, The Structure of Evolutionary Biology, he states that constraints that have to do, he sets a constraint with everything that we're talking about, the restrictions. That is something that has a negative connotation, and he wants to change the value. He does not want to change the polarity. We can see it as something positive, and he wants to link these restrictions with the creativity. So the idea of my talk was precisely how Lewontin is evolving, but precisely from having some conceptions on what science is, he goes over this ingenuity of saying that the fact that there is a metaphor, it makes that what I am telling you is not scientific. Of course not. We need to use metaphors. We need to replace them to continue creating science, but to improve the science we're doing. And the last part, I think that it has to do with this discussion on dialectic, to understand the fact that yes, to live this evolutionary sense that is really positivist and elementalist, to say that evolution is changed with fixed laws, to this conception of the dialectic that I don't know if it could be more Hegelian or Marxist, or maybe more original to what Lewontin thought, but we need to learn not in the sense of the authors, but what are they trying to tell us regarding nature, and that it has to do not only with the fact that the objects are changing, they are not only evolving because they change or because of the phenomena change, but the laws that are around this phenomena are also transforming. We also being part of this. And I think that it is something that is not even in the philosophy of the science. It used to be in the pragmatism. I mentioned Charles other person. Okay.
Estabas en mute, lo puedes repetir. No, no es cierto.
Hey, David, you were muted. Repeat all that. No, just kidding. So with that, we would close today's sessions. Thank you very much for this rich discussion. Thank you very much for joining us. So we're going to transmission, and for those who are here, we have tacos in the place. So, well, we're going to close this session. In the afternoon, we're going to have some talks here at the science school. We have two, and Trevor Pierce is going to be in the postgraduate units. Okay, I don't know if... Okay, these are only presential activities. Okay, so thank you very much.